Are your buns lacking a soft and fluffy texture and becoming tough after they cool down? Let's tackle this issue today and make them together. First, activate the yeast by dissolving it in warm water. Dissolve the sugar and salt in hot water, mix thoroughly, and set aside. Pour the sugar and salt solution into the flour and mix until well combined. Then, pour in the yeast mixture and stir until it forms a smooth and lumpy dough. Let it rise for 30 minutes. Shape the dough and let it rest for 15 minutes before steaming.
Delicious! The secret to making tasty bawzi lies in the dough. Today, I'm going to share the recipe with you. Let's start with 500 grams of flour. Add 5 grams of sugar, 5 grams of yeast, and 10 grams of lard. Pour in around 260 grams of warm water and stir until it forms lump. Then, knead it into a smooth dough. You can knead it on a countertop for a while to help it ferment better and become denser. The dough for bawzi should be softer than the dough for mantou, so that the bawzi skin turns out soft and elastic. Let the dough ferment until it doubles in size. This is when you know it's well fermented, with lots of air bubbles and a very soft texture. Sprinkle some dry flour on the dough pad. Place the well-fermented dough on it, gently press to release the air, and then roll it into a long strip. Cut it into small pieces and flatten them into round and thin bawzi skins, with the middle slightly thicker. Use your hands to fold the bawzi, just like you would with a straw. Remember, the dough for bawzi should be softer than the dough for mantou, so that the bawzi skin will be thin, tender, and pure white. Don't forget to save this recipe and give it a try.
A friend left a message asking how to make the skin of steamed buns and why they always turn out dry and blistered. Today, I will share the details with you. First, let's talk about the amount of yeast. Since the dough for steamed buns tends to be soft, we only need to use 2 to 3 grams of yeast per kilogram. Using too much yeast can easily cause over-fermentation and make it difficult to control. For beginners, salt is also important. We can mix salt and sugar together in the dough. Adding a little salt when making buns can increase the elasticity of the dough and make it less likely to break. Now let's talk about water. The amount of water used for steaming buns is different from that used for steaming mantou. Generally, the dough for steamed buns needs to be slightly softer, which will result in a softer texture. On the other hand, mantou needs to have a slightly harder texture to give it a three-dimensional shape. Another important factor is the yeast. When dissolving yeast in warm water, try to create a scene like the one shown in the video, as it will yield better results. As for the flour, it is best to use medium gluten flour. If you use high gluten flour, make sure to reduce the amount slightly to increase the chances of success. Using high gluten flour requires some skill. Next, let's talk about kneading the dough. After adding salt, we need to stir the dough just like when making dumpling wrappers, so that the salt is evenly distributed and can function better. When adding water, we usually make the dough slightly soft, so try to add all the water in stages and then knead it into a ball. This method is easier. Additionally, we need to continue kneading the dough to ensure that there are no dry lumps inside. After kneading it smooth, it will be easier to work with and the resulting skin will be smoother. As you can see, the dough should have good elasticity, so when pressed, it should bounce back. At this stage, we need to let the dough rest and ferment. Since the current temperature is relatively low, try to create a warm environment for fermentation, which will speed up the process. The key is to observe the state of the dough after fermentation. First, the volume should increase. There should be more air bubbles, and when tapped, there should be a hollow sound. After opening it up, the dough should be filled with air bubbles. It's not about the size of the air bubbles, but when you lightly press it, if it doesn't bounce back, it means it hasn't fermented enough. If you let it ferment too vigorously, it will collapse when you press it lightly, and your steamed buns will never turn out well. Another thing is that many people don't know when the gluten has formed. In fact, it's quite simple. When kneading the dough, you will feel that the dough becomes tighter and harder. At this point, the gluten has formed, and you don't need to knead it for a longer time. When the dough is in this state, as shown in the video, the surface should be smooth and without small bubbles, and it should be relatively flat. At this point, you can directly shape it into a long strip to make buns. If you are still unsure whether the dough is kneaded properly, after shaping it into a long strip, You can check again by picking it up. The surface should be smooth, without small bubbles or uneven spots. After dividing the dough into pieces, you can also check by pressing it flat. If there are no small bubbles on the surface and it is relatively flat without any patterns, then the dough is considered good. If you still can't be sure, you can roll out a piece of dough to check. The surface of the rolled dough should be smoother and have small air bubbles. This way, you can determine if the gluten has formed and whether the dough will blister when steamed. As long as you can follow the instructions mentioned above to make the dough, it will be easier to avoid problems such as blistering, a burnt surface, or dryness when steaming buns at home. You can try making a bun and see for yourself. After filling and pleating, the bun will have clear folds and a smooth surface, which will make it look more beautiful when steamed. That's all for this video. Thank you once again for your support and watching. See you in the next video.